All right, friends. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time in the last few weeks, we're on the third week of a kind of conversational sermon series where we're working our way through Genesis. The first 2 weeks, we talked about creation. This week, we're talking about Noah and the flood. It's a little bit different. Part of why I'm not up in the pulpit is there will be lots of moments where I'm asking for your thoughts. It's not a pop quiz, just a conversation. But to catch us up between creation and here, a couple things happened. But the big thing that happens between these stories is just after Adam and Eve are banished from the Garden of Eden, that's where the Cain and Abel story is, right? And which is actually the first mention of sin in the Bible. Fun fact or not fun fact. But we know that Cain kills Abel out of jealousy for God's favor. And eventually, Adam and Eve have a third son, Seth. Then Genesis gives us this long genealogy that connects Seth to Noah. And that kind of brings us to the beginning of this story. But I also wanted to recall what we talked about with the two creation stories earlier and these two traditions, the priestly text and the Yahwist text. We call them sometimes P and J. That's just because in the German, Yahwist starts with the J. So there you know. So these two traditions persist throughout Genesis, and we're going to talk about them today. But after the creation stories, they start getting more intertwined. It's not like you get one account and then the other and you compare. They start braiding together. And if you've ever had the experience where you've been reading through some of these stories and you read a paragraph and you're like, but they just said that 1 second ago. Why did this get repeated? That's what it kind of looks like when you're going through the text. So a good rule of thumb is if you spot what feels like a redundancy, it's usually the inclusion of the other text. So, this brings us up to the flood story. And it is a long one. It is 4 chapters. We are not going to read all of it. We're going to kind of move as we go. I'm going to give us some bullet points and some quotes. And then there are a few spots where we'll have longer passages that will be pulled directly from the text. So, the Noah story. It starts with an observation from God looking down on the earth. The text says, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually." It says that this grieved God to his heart, and that God was sorry he had made them. But then, just a few verses later, the moment is retold with some different language, like we were just saying. Starting in verse 11 of chapter 6, it says, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence." So the first question I want to ask us, any guesses on which account is which, just from that? We have observing the wickedness of humans towards each other as the big sin that God is observing. And then we have corruption. Now, I'll give you this answer for sure, but the text that says that the Lord saw the wickedness of humankind, this is from the Yahwist tradition, which tends to focus on relationship more than, and these are not strict lines, but focuses on relationship a little bit more than order through structure. If you recall the creation stories, Genesis 1, this is with all the days and the creation, the separation of light and dark and heaven and earth, that's the priestly account. It really emphasizes this kind of cosmic order. And then, yes, the Genesis 2 account of in the garden and the Adam and Eve story and the serpent, that's the Yahwist account that tends to talk about God a little more anthropomorphically, a little more God is grieving in his heart, not that the order of the universe has been upset. So, both of these are there, and they will show up throughout this story. But before we keep moving, I want to ask, because it doesn't show up a lot throughout the rest of Genesis, this word corrupt. What do you think this meant by that? The text doesn't really explain. What kind of corruption is connected to violence? That should be 11, chapter 6, verse 11. And I do invite you to follow along in your Bibles. You'll see where I'm hitting fast forward, but there's some lines in here that are interesting.
It seems like separated from God, that's corrupt, right?
Steve said separated from God. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, Julia?
I don't remember the Hebrew or the Greek. The modern idea of corruption is to abuse one's powers over assets held for the public good in return for private, for one's own remuneration, to make a deal with someone to give special access to that person because that person is going to enrich you.
Absolutely. I'm going to repeat that for everyone to hear. Julia was saying that the kind of modern connotation of corruption is dealing with public goods in a way that narrows down their service for private interests, special treatment in a way. And I for an indictment that comes so quickly in the text after talking about creation and all this abundance, I think that resonates with me a little bit. I hear that. Now, we won't have a definitive answer, but just to get us thinking and talking. So, God tells Noah to build the ark. It probably will not surprise you that it's the priestly account that talks so much about the cubits, which is 1.5 foot approximately, so you know. And then it says, God says, for my part, so he gives Noah all these instructions, and it says, for my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die, but I will establish my covenant with you. It doesn't say what the covenant is there, but this is a little foreshadowing. And then God tells Noah to fill the ark with 2 of every creature and every kind of food that is eaten. So yes, plants are also included there. And then the text says that Noah did all that commanded him, all that God commanded him. Now, another question I want to bring up here is, why Noah? The text says that the Lord found favor in Noah, but it doesn't really say why. And we won't be able to answer this definitively, but I wonder if in your imagination, many of us have been hearing this story our whole lives. What characteristics about Noah do you think God might have seen with favor? Good moral judgment, yeah?
I think it's because he was as common as any of us. He was probably the most likely, the most average person on earth, and we could all see our way into it.
I love that. He said the most common of us, the most average person. I like this a lot. The text doesn't give additional details about what would have made Noah so special, so I find that intriguing.
Blameless in his generation.
Blameless in his generation, as the text says, yes. Blameless. What an interesting word there. We'll move on, and we can keep filling in the gaps on this question as we go. There is a lot of text to cover, and I'm trying so hard to keep us to approximately 20 minutes. So chapter 7 is where we get to the flood. And in verse 4, God says, "For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." But again, a moment later, in verse 11, the text says that the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Do you hear how these are 2 kind of different ideas about where the flood is coming from? One, you have a torrential downpour for 40 days, and the other is the fountains of the great deep. Does that phrase, the great deep, ring a bell for anyone? This is the same language that Genesis 1 uses to talk about this primordial state of creation where it's just water. So this is a very specific recall from the priestly tradition to think about creation again as you're hearing this. Before continuing with the story, I wonder though, do these different explanations for the flood at this point seem to imply different things about God? Not necessarily in conflict, but perhaps different emphases about God. Cambridge. Mm-hmm.
It's just a little bit of a different, more passive version where it's like, I was protecting you and now I'm just going to let this happen.
Yeah.
I feel like I just get a different scope of action.
Yeah. Yeah. Were people able to hear that all right? She was just saying that the idea that the water comes from sort of collapsing this cosmic structure feels less, has a different implication for intent, I think is fair. Whereas the rains, sending the rains, feels, Cambridge is saying it feels to her a bit more, is it fair to say aggressive or angry? Vindictive, punishing, yes, all of these things. They're very live. And I should say that it is the Yahwist account that really emphasizes God being upset and grieving in his heart at seeing this violence. So I do think that connects. Tony, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a stretch, but and if I'm saying that also because I want to avoid the punishing image of God in Genesis. But when you asked about corrupt, I went to the Hebrew.
Yeah.
It's the same word for destroy, that God is going to destroy. So I wonder if it's as if the earth with the corruption is already destroyed by our action, and it's not that God is punishing by the flood, but the destruction that is already there, it's more happening with. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think that's fascinating. Just to repeat, and also for friends on Zoom who might not be able to hear, Tony was just saying that the Hebrew word for corrupt is also the word that is used for destroy, and the implication there could be that the corruption that is being called out is already sort of the self-destruction that is occurring because of this wickedness of people, this inclination towards violence. Yeah. And Kim?
I always wondered how Noah even knew what rain was.
Mm-hmm.
It hadn't done that before, ever. And so God to tell him, I will send rain. What did that mean? And is that for our benefit? It's just, what was that? That was something that had not happened.
Right. Yeah, Kim was saying that sending rain here, this is really the first description of rain that we get, and how did Noah know what to even imagine from that? I would suggest that in that not knowing is a different, or rather a particular kind of faith being expressed, right? Obeying commands and building this specifically outlined boat when you don't even really grasp what you've just been told is coming. I like that. I like that a lot. But the priestly, go ahead, sorry. Yes. And I should say that this phrase that I mentioned earlier, that Noah did all that God commanded him, if you are kind of following along in your Bibles, you'll see that that shows up several times. And while I don't think we should say that's the one thing about Noah that God really liked, the repetition of that phrase shows that here, this doing, and without maybe understanding completely, is a very important feature of Noah here. But the priestly account continues. It says, the waters swelled so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, domestic animals, wild animals, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all human beings, everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life, died. Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark. And the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days. Now, again, the accounts provide different information about how long it is. The Yahwist account says 40 days. The priestly says 150. Either way, those are both lengths of time much longer than I tend to imagine when I remember this story casually. And so let's just sit on the 150 days number, because we're really firmly in the priestly account for a little bit. That's a long time to be a very specific kind of safe, right? Preserved from the massive destruction, but also surrounded by it, literally floating above it. So I want to pause the story for a second here and ask, either in the Bible or in your life or our shared life, does that scene feel familiar? Does that feeling of safe amid a whole lot of mess, I wonder what that brings up for you, for any of us. Yeah, Winnie. Yeah, Winnie was saying it kind of feels like being in church a little bit, having space to be safe with your thoughts and your prayers, knowing, not ignoring that outside of the church there's a whole lot of mess going on, to put it lightly. What else? Say it again? Lonely. Yes, loneliness in that. It's what a strange thing to be safe and lonely at the same time, right? Tony.
Being with someone or a group of people who are vulnerable and going through something similar to what I go through, I know this feels weird, but when I'm in a miserable situation, I want to be with people who are miserable.
Yeah.
There's something very special about that makes me feel safe. Yeah.
I don't know if you heard, but Tony was saying it may sound strange, doesn't sound strange to me, but if you're like experiencing some real misery, sometimes being around people who are also going through and struggling with misery is an interesting and very human antidote to that loneliness. Being together in sorrow is a specific, but a real kind of togetherness.
I would think that there would have been a tremendous amount of work on board ship.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's all of these creatures and things to be fed.
Yeah.
I would imagine things to be kept on, plants to be kept alive so things can be fed.
Right.
So I imagine they were very busy as opposed to being on a crew.
Yeah, and being busy with the routine of caring for all that creation that you scooped up into the boat. Great way to pass the time, right? I'll tell y'all that what came into my head all of a sudden was the experience of going through COVID. Knowing that once we got to that place where we had enough knowledge that we could reasonably be safe ourselves, but couldn't really get out of our arcs. It was what a strange time it was. And there's a lot of feelings there that I'm tempted to want to project onto Noah and his family here. And maybe that's fair, maybe it's not. Yeah, go ahead.
What I thought of that people might believe is that they were somehow among the select. It's a chosen people notion.
Yeah.
And so the danger on one side is that God has selected you to very few people. On the other side is the idea that, boy, I am something really special.
Yeah.
A dangerous idea.
Yeah, right. I mean, quite the opposite of what you were saying about Noah being the most average. He was, just for those that didn't hear, he was saying, and tell me your name, I'm so sorry.
John.
John, right. John was saying that thinking about Noah and his family and dealing with this feeling of being selected or being chosen, and how on the one hand that can be a beautiful thing, and on the other hand, you could really go to your head pretty fast. Absolutely, and I would say, I would add to that, when I was reading this, preparing for today, I thought a lot about survivor's guilt and how strange it must have felt for them to be both grateful to be saved, and I can't imagine that Noah just hated everybody around him. I mean, it doesn't sound like the Noah described in the text. There had to have been people that they missed and mourned. Now, oh, sorry, go ahead, Ruby. Yeah.
When they emerged from the ark, everybody that's special and saved, what their thoughts were about those people that the 40 days of rain apparently cleansed the destruction and all of the things that he wanted to get rid of.
Yeah.
They wonder what happened to those people.
Ruby's saying, I wonder what they must have thought getting off of the ark at the end and really being safe and seeing what had happened, right? Seeing it up close. Yeah, absolutely.
I think something about it does sound kind of wonderful when we don't acknowledge it. I'm very close to my family, and being locked away for 40 days and 40 nights with them sounds kind of wonderful.
Yeah, right?
We'd make popcorn, and we'd sing, and something about it could be just lovely.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that does remind me a little bit of some COVID experiences where I look back some at lockdown, and there's a terror underneath so much of it. But there were also some really beautiful encapsulated moments with my loved ones, and even just tending to the house plants, I had never been so routined and focused on care. It's interesting. I think we'll all be unpacking this for a long time. I want to give us just a snippet of history that might pull some of this together before we move on with the rest of the story. I had this professor over at Union, Dr. David Carr. Did you take classes with him? Okay, you did. Okay, yeah. David is a brilliant, empathetic biblical scholar. And he's written a lot about the authorship of Genesis. And the idea, the notion that there are these different traditions, the Yahwist, the priestly, and eventually a third one, Elohist, but we'll get to that later. Biblical scholarship very much agrees on that. That's pretty much taken as for granted. But one of David's big ideas, which he researches well and argues well, and I think I may have mentioned in a sermon here before, is that while those traditions existed orally for a very long time, for many generations, they're only written down for the first time in the 6th century BC, when Jerusalem had been conquered by Babylon and much of the Jewish people there were driven into captivity. And it's in captivity that they are for the first time putting down on paper these stories that these traditions they've held for so long and for so many generations. And David's suggestion, which if you consider and look for this in the text, I think bears out. But his suggestion is that a big reason why they were writing down is in case the worst happened, to preserve these stories. And so I want to ask, with that in mind, does the flood feel a little different? Does the ark feel a little different? This notion of being safe, confronting survivor's guilt, but not totally safe. You're in captivity in another country. You don't know what's going to happen next. I see so much of that in this text. I'm seeing some nods. Does it feel like anything's shifting for you right now? Nod. nods, some beard strokes. This is good. This is good. We'll keep moving. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I think what you're making me realize is the first time that Noah may not have felt that safe on the ark. If anybody's ever done any sailing or spent any time in open water, especially open water that is from floodwaters and didn't exist, you probably actually didn't feel all that safe. And so contrasting well, God says we're all going to survive, but it sure is wild outside. Might feel a lot like God says the people of Israel will survive, but we sure are in Babylonian captivity. So.
Absolutely. Just for everyone in the back, Nathan was saying he's considering the idea that Noah maybe didn't feel that safe, actually. Being on open water with no land in sight in a boat you made yourself. Yeah. Safe for now, but for how long? Who knows? So, chapter 8. We're doing this. We get to chapter 8. This is where the waters subside. And chapter 8 tells us that God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and all the domestic animals. The priests say that God made a wind blow over the earth and the waters subsided. More echoes of Genesis 1, right? The waters subsided, the fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed, the rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters gradually receded from the earth. The way the priests describe it, it's almost like watching this collapse in reverse. Water's returning to the ground, but it's also returning to the heavens. Everything's kind of, they say subside, and that's a very intentional word. Now, the Yahwists, in their story, the rain is non-cosmic, so they talk about the rain drying up. Subtle distinction there. But it's the Yahwists that have the story about the birds being sent out and the dove returning with the olive branch. Now, this will be the last big chunk I want to read, but both versions culminate in telling us that Noah and his family and all the animals exit the ark and God speaks with them. And this is where we get the covenant that was mentioned before. So I'm going to read this. It is chapter 9, verses 8 through 15. Feel free to follow along. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh." What do we hear in that? Did anything jump out at you that you were surprised to hear?
I think it made God sad to see his creation be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And they couldn't bear big victory.
Yeah. Lynn's saying that she feels this sense of sorrow in God's words, that destroying creation made God sad. And I think that holds with this perspective that the Yahwists bring of this is the same God who grieved in their heart when they saw people killing people, right? What else? Julia.
It goes on. It says, God sent fire, not floods and sun.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I hear this. I will not destroy the earth by And then I thought that changes my prayer to, well, Lord God, save us, help us save ourselves from destroying the earth by fire,
Hmm.
which in a time of climate change seems to resonate.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Julia was saying that noting how specific the part of the covenant is that God says they will not destroy the earth by flood. And there's that hymn about the fire next time, and thinking about climate change in the present and the notion of asking God for help that we don't destroy creation with fire, right? It's very humbling. I feel that. We're about near the end of the time for this talk. I want to just take us out on one note, which is that, we'll be talking about this throughout the coming weeks. We're taking this series right up to Welcome Back Sunday on September 7th. But Genesis preserves both of these Yahwist and priestly traditions. And in a way, I feel proudly flaunts the redundancies and differences. It doesn't try to fuse them together. Sometimes we, the readers, try to do that. But it really preserves this distinction. And to me, I think that's a very good thing, because what it does is it models a certain kind of big tent sensibility about who God is. When they were writing this down, they didn't say, okay, we're going to take a vote, and whichever version of God gets the most votes wins. They said, well, we're going to keep both of these and let them just be in conversation. And if we in the modern age want to say, well, it said 40 days and nights here and 150 days here, this is a contradiction and a problem, maybe it's not a contradiction and a problem. Maybe it's a compliment. And what I love about this is that I think Christianity specifically often has an impulse to reduce and unify our understanding of Scripture out of a desire for oneness. But I'm really grateful to be reminded in a belief that in God that does not demand that kind of homogeneity. It does not demand that we all see the exact same thing in God. What it actually asks us to do is to share all the different ways that we see God with each other and let that become the story. So as we move forward, next week we're going to be talking about the Tower of Babel, which is one of my absolute favorites. We're going to get very nerdy about it. But hold on to that notion that in conversation and in community, by preserving all these different perspectives, that it really adds up to something a little closer to what God may be trying to tell us.